Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest on for the first time, Dr. Pack. That's his name for short. So I told him off air I'm going to give it a shot here, see how it goes. He gave me some tips, so I'm gonna give it a shot. So it's Patroclus Androlakis Korakakis.
Yeah, not you were like 98% there because you stopped a bit with the first surname, but yeah, pretty much,
So how do you
more or
say it?
less. It's Andrew Lakis. It's like the name Andrew and then
Androlakis.
Lakis.
That's
Yeah, there you go.
easy. That's
It
easy.
is easy. Like, it's
Man,
not. It's one of those names that is compatible with Americans and English speakers, like native English speakers. It's just that when you see it, you're like, yeah.
now that you say that, I think I'm just going to call you that the entire time now, just by your full name, so we can just roll with it. It's pretty easy now that you say it once.
Yeah.
How do you say the first name?
The first name is Patroclus,
Patrick Lewis. Okay, so like Patrick,
but
basically.
don't. No, but yeah, yeah.
I always wanted to give that a shot. Anytime I saw you on podcast, I was like, man, that is insane. But definitely not as bad when you actually say it. But we're going to call you Pack for short. Pack, appreciate you coming on today, man. Like I said, I've heard you on multiple podcasts. You have a ton of great research out there. So looking forward to chatting with you today. And yeah, thank you
Thank you.
for coming on today.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Awesome. What I typically like to do with new guests is just your brief background. You don't have to go super in depth in it, but just maybe a general idea so people get an idea of how you got here. And then I do like to touch base on training as well too, but we'll see where the conversation leads us. So I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, for sure. So I got into lifting at approximately the age of 15, 16 years old. I went to a boarding school in Germany, and my one of my best friends now and my sort of roommate at the time was grew up in martial arts and working out. So he got me into lifting. We had a pair of dumbbells in the room and we would do curls before going to bed. And then I somewhat enjoyed the feeling from the curls. And I was like, okay, let's maybe go to the school gym because I had him to be by my side and show me stuff. And yeah, I fell in love with lifting as a kid that was not very athletic. Lifting was the one sort of physical activity that I could do that felt nice. And I felt like I could actually push myself. I enjoyed pushing myself and I enjoyed the fact that I was seeing things changing. Like I was working and things were happening. And that then essentially, I was bit by the iron bug, which as then started like essentially triggered a cascade of actions and reading about nutrition, reading about training. And because I was somebody who always enjoyed geeking out about stuff, the more I read and educated myself and got involved in the scene and started watching YouTube back in 2012, 2013, the more I was like, okay, this science thing makes sense. This is how we can get closer to the truth as far as what we need to do goes. Obviously, while also looking up to a ton of practitioners that were not necessarily like scientists or evidence based, as it was called back in the day. And then I decided to pursue a degree in sports science, which I did here at Solon University in the UK. I enjoyed research and I was fortunate enough to have some really cool mentors here, James Steele and James Fisher, who are prolific researchers and like they were hungry researchers in the sense that they weren't physically like actually hungry, they were well fed. James Steele is shredded, so maybe he's not that well fed, but that's by choice at least. And they got me into research. They got me into critical. They helped me a lot with my critical thinking skills. And then after my bachelor's, I started publishing research, which then allowed me to get into a PhD program without doing a master's because I had essentially published, I think it was two or three, like I had published in journals, and that sort of covered the master's requirement. And I started my PhD here at Solent, looked at the minimum effective dose for strength and power lifters. And in the meantime, I was doing a bunch of research, coaching people, training for my personal development for strength and hypertrophy, and just yeah, geeking out over all things lifting. And as it stands, I've been coaching full time for a few years, leading a research review, but we're soon announcing a different I will be announcing a different sort of role that I'll be taking on in the next few days. But it's all focused around lifting. So that's a long version of me.
Awesome. Yeah, no, appreciate you sharing that. As I flipped over on my notes, I had a introduction and I just got straight into your name and I didn't even say that. So I apologize for that because I like to introduce my guests before, but you did a great job of summing it up. So yeah, obviously a ton of knowledge here in this field. Like you said, you got your PhD. The minimum effective training dose was the topic that you had for your PhD, and we definitely want to talk about that today. So You mentioned you have something coming out in a couple days. Now, I usually backlog these, so this won't be out for a little while. Is that something that you can share now, or do you want to hold off on that until you make the official announcement?
I'll wait until the official announcement, but it's essentially more content, more sort of science-based, the free content out there through a certain platform. Just, I don't know. Just because it hasn't been announced officially yet, I'm just being cautious, not because I care that something will happen, just to be fair.
Hey, absolutely. Totally understand that. Cool. Yeah, as far as like the research goes, how is this something that you see yourself doing forever, or do you, yeah, or is it something that, hey, you did it for a little bit, you're good to go, or yeah, do you continue, you see yourself continuing on this path?
So research is the one thing that I would love to be actually doing for a living, but unfortunately, I mean, it may be possible in the near future in the future at some point to do. But as you may know, research in our field, like strength and hypertrophy, especially in the context of recreational lifters and people who want to get jacked and just get strong for the sake of getting strong, is not like really a career aside from a few places that focus that. And one of those places is the lab that I'm a part of now, the Applied Muscle and Development Lab over at Lehman College. Shout out to the lab and to Brad Schoenfeld, who is the lead, our leader, the puppet master who is controlling us. I know, just kidding, obviously. But yeah, I could research for me has been mostly like a hobby because I don't get paid directly from it. Obviously, like we can't discount that being a researcher indirectly helps open other doors and build your profile, but it's much less than people imagine. So yes, definitely going to continue doing research. We have a lot of cool projects in the pipeline. I love the research side of things quite a bit. And it's honestly, if I ever become a millionaire, or let's manifest when I become a millionaire, let's manifest billionaire. When I become a billionaire, cool.
There you go.
I will be definitely like, if I ever didn't have to worry about money for whatever reason, I would still be doing research as if my livelihood depended on it because it's just really cool and it gives my life meaning. Not to
Awesome.
sound too cliche here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. So yeah, like you said, you supplement it through other things, coaching and things like that. Do you find that, because I know your research focuses on muscle strength, hypertrophy, and stuff like that, do you tend to gravitate towards one, like more of the strength side of things, or do you find that there is like a pretty big overlap there and you are in both?
I've slowly started to shift focus, not slightly more towards, I mean, it's not just like pure hypertrophy because we're looking at certain things and how they affect both hypertrophy and strength, but maybe a slight focus towards hypertrophy because I've done a lot of strength stuff. And I'm personally interested in looking into a few more things related to hypertrophy, like exercise technique, for example. Because with strength, that would be it would be a completely different approach. But we have few cool projects in the pipeline, a study on supersets, study potentially on external momentum and how it affects hypertrophy, the first study to look at the effect of exercise technique on hypertrophy, and a bunch of other stuff in the pipeline at the moment.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, no, I know you guys are really diving into the technique side of things, which I do want to talk to you about today. Really looking forward to that. Cool. So you start out more strength background. Now you said you're a little bit more towards the hypertrophy side, but like you said, it's never just like one or the other. There's probably going to be some overlap there with that. Cool. What about your current training? How does that kind of look? Is it the same thing? You came from more of a strength background and kind of switch over to hypertrophy, or do you kind of have a blend? What does that look like for you?
Yeah. People often assume that I'm a powerlifter just because I've done like my PhD specifically in powerlifters, but and I do follow powerlifting. I'm going to the Sheffield, for example, now at the beginning of February, and we are going to be doing research even at some research at the Sheffield specifically, and research with powerlifters. I find powerlifters and powerlifting very interesting, and I keep up with the sport. But I personally identify as a lifter. I like lifting stuff, and I like training mostly for hypertrophy because it's a bit more fast paced. There's more variety, and it's not obviously it's numbers focused in the sense that you have to push yourself and add weight and do extra reps, but there's less pressure and more flexibility when it comes to training if I feel like doing something random. And my training has been freestyle for the past few years. So I don't follow a program. I try to keep things relatively consistent, and I do mostly hypertrophy in quotation marks training, aside from the overhead press and the deadlift, which I train for specifically for 1 repetition maximum strength, just because I enjoy it.
Cool. So a little bit of a blend, but you have mostly hypertrophy and then a little bit of, hey, I'm going to train for deadlift and overhead press and those specifically, or just because that's something that you enjoy there with that. So would you say it's more of like a kind of power building type thing, or do you not go into that kind of labeling things like that?
Sure, because we had that, didn't really understand the whole debate about power building and why it was so complicated. Because all what let me put it this way. I'm essentially maximizing hypertrophy for the majority of the muscle groups that I train, simply because I'm not training legs properly. All I'm doing for my legs is one set of squats per week, one heavy triple, and for deadlifts I only do singles. So I do 5 to 10 singles per week, but I'm one of those individuals who's blessed with relatively solid leg genetics. I can take off time from squatting for a year, and I'm back to squatting 4 plates for reps pretty quickly. But at the same time, yeah, I would call it power building, but I don't know. Like, people seem to think that power building is like powerlifting with some accessories thrown on top. Other people define it differently. The addition of singles on top of hypertrophy work allows me to make meaningful 1 RM strength gains. So yeah, it would be power building.
Right. Yeah. Just at that point, just labeling things. Certain people want to have, oh, so what is that exactly? But it's okay. There's so many different ways to go about it. So for you, what are maybe some like kind of things that you see people get wrong when they do want to try to blend? Have a little bit of blend of both. What are some like kind of common mistakes that you see there with that?
I'd say that from my perspective, obviously, in my opinion, et cetera,
Yeah.
I think that a lot of people feel pursue goals that sound cool in their head, or they like the idea of being able to, I don't know, bench 3 plates or how many ever plates or whatever, but they don't really care about it that much. So they end up committing to 2 goals at the same time, when in reality, all they really care about, or all they really enjoy, is goal number one. It depends on, and that sometimes can be affected, but by what is hyped in social media these days. And I've had that happen with some clients that wanted to change their focus and add this and that, but in reality, they didn't really care, but they felt like, oh, it would be cool if I could squat X amount of weight. And the same way, I think, oh, it would be cool if I got stage lean and had a few pictures on stage. Yeah, having those pictures would be cool, but I don't like the process. I don't want to do that. I would hate myself if I went through that process. So that's, I guess, the one mistake I'd say. When it comes to actually implementing power building, in my opinion, if you want to get jacked and also very good at 1 repetition maximum strength, having lower volume, super specific 1 RM work there may be best than going about it oh, I'm going to do my big compounds at the beginning and spend 2 hours squatting and benching, when in reality you could do a heavy single, couple of back off sets on each, and then focus on like really like hypertrophy specific or hypertrophy quote unquote optimized work after that.
Yeah, so it sounds like again, you could probably get away with doing kind of less strength work overall than you think and spending more of your time towards that hypertrophy if your goal is to have that again, like you said, 1 RM strength and then getting jacked in the process. And I'm assuming your research on minimum effective dose, I'm assuming probably changed that, your kind of thought on that, yeah, over time.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I also see that most people want to get primarily jacked, and then like those that engage in power building, and then the strength follows. And obviously there's this false idea that training for hypertrophy doesn't get you stronger. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're training in the 30 to 50 rep range with just your body weight, you're still getting stronger. But yeah, maybe your 1 repetition maximum strength on the squat is not gonna be that great. But if you're doing sets of 6 to 12 reps on compound, like on, I don't know, on like the basic barbell lifts, you're still going to see 1 repetition maximum strength improvements. They may not be as great as if you were to throw in a few heavy, like more specific singles to work to essentially become better at the test that you're using to assess strength. Because that's just 1 repetition maximum strength. What about 6 to 8 RM strength? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It sounds like, what you're trying to say there is you need to practice that one rep max to get good at it. Just training in 6 to 12, it's like, yeah, you will get stronger, but you need to specifically be in that one rep, like training at one rep to get used to it. Because there is a skill component to that kind of one rep max aspect of it. You need to practice that.
Yeah, you need to if you really care about it. But I'm also saying that if you're just doing hypertrophy work, don't think that just because we've termed it hypertrophy work, you're not going to get significantly stronger. It's likely that you will, if you test, let's say you go through a hypertrophy block and you test your 1RM strength before, and then you do exclusively sets of 6 to 12 repetitions and you progress load over time. I would bet a lot of money that after, let's say, 16 weeks, if you were to do a little taper or take a few days off and then test your strength, I would be surprised if you haven't made substantial strength gains. Not optimal, but substantial.
I also feel like too with this one rep max, a couple things there. You hit on like the tapering aspect of it. So I think people probably the fatigue aspect of it, I feel like with strength, you probably want to be a little bit more fresh with it. And then also with the one rep max, I'm assuming too, probably an issue you see there is just people trying to hit their one rep max too often as well too. In that process, is that something that you can test to as well there?
I don't know. I feel like that's a bit of a boogeyman because, like, we don't have any data showing that's necessarily bad. We have some data showing that going very close to failure very often is probably not your best bet. But at the same time, like, heavy singles, frequent heavy singles, I don't see anything wrong with that as long as it's methodical. Keep in mind the odd, oh, I'm with the lads in the gym. We've had 700 milligrams of caffeine and we're all hyping each other up and fuck it, let's max out on the bench. Totally fine. And it's part of the lifting journey. And like some of those moments are most memorable moments as lifters, besides all the seriousness and the science stuff. However, randomly doing that consistently day in and day out can have more negatives than positives, not necessarily from a physiological standpoint, maybe to an extent if you're like pushing yourself to your absolute max and missing lifts, but psychologically as well, going in the gym and either missing lifts or feeling, oh, unless I get a 1 RMPR today, it's not going to be a good day. I've seen a lot of people fall in that trap, and it's a weird trap to get out of.
So mentally as well too, there, not like you said, not just physically, but mentally as well too. It can be a tough thing as well.
Anecdotally,
Yeah.
because you do have working with so many strength athletes and recreational strength enthusiasts over time, people tend to view week to week strength fluctuations as an indication, or like a top single as 100% accurate indication of their peaked strength. And it's, bro, just because your YOLO single or the YOLO overshot single that you did wasn't an all-time PR, that's not necessarily indicative that you're not improving your strength, especially if you're just fatigued and you haven't necessarily peaked and it's just on a random day you were like, oh, I had a bad day at work. Let me get my boost from training. I'm gonna go for a new PR. I missed it. I'm not getting stronger.
Yeah, because like you said, there's a lot of things that could be masking that strength at that moment. Like you said, fatigue, or again, just being a little bit more stressed out, stuff like that. Not putting too much stock into those week to week fluctuations there because we understand that they can be impacted by a lot of things. Cool. Any other follow ups to that or thoughts around that before we dive into the technique for hypertrophy talk?
I would say if you're looking at performance increases over time and you want to see if things are working and you're doing some form of like power building where you have strength work in there, consider taking a couple of steps back and viewing your training a bit more holistically and a bit more longer term, and also consider how exercises that involve the musculature that is also involved majorly in the lifts that you're training for strength, how have those been progressing? Because let's say your single on the bench that you're doing as your strength work is pretty much the same for the last 4 weeks, but all your tricep accessory work and maybe some of your shoulder pressing or other pushing work has increased. The fact that you're still lifting the same weight for the same RPE for the single while doing a bunch of volume behind the scenes that is slowly going up, that's a positive thing. And you shouldn't just view each lift on its own. Like you should view it as part of your program and how that compares to maybe a few months before or a few blocks before, rather than how that compares over the past couple of weeks.
No, I love that. Yeah, great addition there. I guess actually one more thing on this before we move on. You hit on like hitting like going closer to like more singles and then being more in that hypertrophy, like 6 to 12 rep range. Is there that no man's land there in that like 3 to 5 rep range? Do you think that again that's something that people make a mistake of hitting a little bit too much there, or do you think that's not necessarily a bad thing?
Nah, like for strength, it's totally fine, and for hypertrophy, it's just inefficient, especially if you're because like for hypertrophy, you know that you have to be close to failure to make solid gains. So, like a triple on bench or like on the deadlift, maybe just taking too much time. But I don't know about the fatigue aspect of it, but maybe psychologically, if you need to get hyped for it to go to that point, and it's just what's the benefit versus doing 8 to 12 reps, being able to focus a bit more on technique, which we'll chat about as well, and just being a bit more in control. Other than that, I wouldn't call it like a bad rep range. And fives can be amazing for hypertrophy too. Nothing wrong with them. It's just how you incorporate them in your training and whether you're like religiously attached to a rep range because you think it's magical.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Let's dive into technique for hypertrophy. I think this was just recently actually published, right? I think was it a preprint for a little bit or was it published the entire time? Optimizing resistance training technique to maximize muscle hypertrophy, a narrative review. You were I believe the lead author on this and had multiple people on it as well too. Jeff Nipper, Brad Schoenfeld, Milo Wolf was on it as well too. So a ton of great people in the hypertrophy field here. So yeah, I thought this was a really cool study and narrative review. So just curious to kind of hear the background on it, reasons for doing this, and then we can talk
Mm,
about the findings and stuff like that.
For sure. Background is that Jeff was interested in doing a study on training technique. So this was the idea of looking at training technique was his. And he was like, okay, it would be cool to do a study and see whether strict training technique actually makes a difference. Because it's important to know that when you go in a gym and you start training and you have the trainer there tell you, okay, you have to stand this way and control the weight and keep it strict and avoid external momentum or avoid whatever, involving other muscle groups. Like those guidelines are mostly based on assumptions and speculation, not direct evidence. And he was like, it would be cool to see if that's actually true. If you go to failure and I'm doing a bicep curl and I'm like, optimizing training technique and ensuring that I'm emphasizing long muscle lengths and blah, 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 blah. Does that actually make a meaningful difference for hypertrophy versus being a bit more lenient or more liberal with my technique? Essentially, just lifting. I'm not necessarily focusing on tempo. I'm not focusing on controlling the eccentric extensively. I'm just getting the weight up and down and going to the point where I'm trying to move the weight with that muscle that I'm trying to target, and I can't do that anymore, and that's why I call it quits. But in order to do that, we needed to first lay a bit of a base and look at what does training technique mean and what is an optimal in quotation marks training technique for hypertrophy. Because like you look on YouTube, you'll see people say it's this and it's that. But depending on who you listen to, it may be X amount of seconds in the eccentric, concentric moved fast. Other people may say do both very slow. Other people will say it doesn't matter. So we needed to lay that base so that we can then utilize whatever the current literature shows in order to inform the design of our study as well as identify gaps in the research. But it's important to note that a narrative review is simply an evidence-based essay written by us. This is like in the hierarchy of evidence, this sits pretty low because it's not like we've performed a systematic search and we've showed you exactly how we found the pieces of literature that we found. It's essentially us compiling the literature and giving you our take on it. Now, do I believe that our take is a bad take or a hot take or a take that would be extremely different if somebody else was to look at the literature? No, but it's important to put that disclaimer out there that this is essentially our take on hypertrophy. And yeah, that's why we did this paper. And this essentially allowed us to have a nice base for that study that we will be running this summer.
Yeah, so it sounds again, I'm glad you explained that because a lot of people would think that it was like a study, kind of like a randomized control trial, but obviously it was not that. You guys were just kind of searching the literature on this and just compiling it. And then, like you said, you were just seeing if they're basically what has the research shown, what's out there, and then just to see what any of the holes are in this topic. And now you guys are going, and like you said, it's going to be able to allow you to set up certain studies now to find out more answers. And I'm sure not just you, but other people as well too will be able to use this to help them set up some studies around this topic as well too.
Yeah, it's also I'd like to note that yeah, it's not original research in the sense that we didn't take a bunch of people and do that, which we will do. But I do feel like the takeaways, although somewhat general, still tick most if not all boxes. In my personal opinion now, and based on the evidence, but that's based on my take on the evidence, and because we don't have direct evidence looking at different configurations of technique, speculating that the information in this review will still allow you to maximize muscle growth. I doubt you'd be missing out on meaningful gains if you were to follow the suggestions presented.
Yeah, it's going to get you pretty much there. And then, like, obviously, you guys are going to continue to find out if any of this, for example, the strict technique versus momentum there with that. I know that was one thing you guys said you wanted to mention, but I don't want to dive in that too much because I want you to go over that. Cool. So set the stage there for why you did it. So if you don't mind now going over some of the findings that you guys had in this.
Sorry, could you
Uh,
repeat that last
yeah,
note?
no. The findings that you guys had while searching the literature on this topic.
Yeah, so we essentially first, believe it or not, there was no like clear definition of what technique constitutes in the literature, which is, bro, it's crazy when you look behind the curtain on I sounded like Alex Jones there a bit. But no, it's legit crazy to see so many things that we regard as, yep, this is established and like the evidence is concrete. I'm going to open up this closet and there's going to be piles of papers. And you open up the closet and it's like a post-it note. And there was no definition for technique. I mean, there were some books that didn't give an exact definition, but described components of technique and so on and so forth. So we suggested actually the following definition. Resistance training exercise technique pertains to the controlled execution of bodily movements to ensure an exercise effectively targets specific muscle groups while minimizing the risk of injury. This involves the orchestration of body positioning and alignment, range of motion, and repetition tempo. So then we essentially took all those different components and broke them down and looked at the relevant literature. So we first looked at tempo, and to my surprise, and against my personal bias, because I've been well doing that, but also instructing clients to really pay attention to the eccentric part of the repetition and make sure that's really nice and slow and controlled, but like actively telling people, hey, slow down a bit more. You could use a bit more control. But when looking at the literature, it doesn't seem to be the literature is not as clear as I thought. So the recommendations for like slow eccentrics and fast concentrics stem from another review that essentially looked at the literature. But even if you look closely in the studies that were reviewed in that review, and it was also a narrative review, if I'm not mistaken, the the takeaway for eccentrics and fast concentrics stems from from a couple of studies that showed that a slower concentric did not show benefit versus a faster concentric, and that in a population in a cohort of older men, a faster concentric resulted in greater hypertrophy than slower concentric. There is some data showing that like a 4 second centric resulted in greater hypertrophy to a 1 second eccentric, but like no statistical significance was found. But the effect sizes showed that they favored the group performing the extended eccentric phase. And then there's another study that showed that an extended concentric phase was better than a faster concentric. So it's all mixed. There's definitely like the one thing I can say with certainty, with some certainty at least, is that we do not have concrete evidence to support the notion that a much slower eccentric is going to be making or breaking your hypertrophy gains, or at least adding a whole lot more, or even a bit more maybe, but like that's a big maybe. Anyways, overall, it does not appear that it appears that significant increases in muscle growth can occur with repetition durations between 2 to 8 seconds. So as long as the entirety of your repetition is somewhere, you could employ whatever tempo you enjoy. Obviously, it's important to go near or to momentary muscular failure. I'll say definitely near. So obviously, some of your reps in the end, the concentric phase will slow down. But overall, the idea of extending the eccentric or the concentric, as you've heard in other schools of thought, is not really based on much. So obviously, controlling the eccentric seems to make sense, having some eccentric control versus, let's say, doing a bicep curl and then just completely letting the weight free fall. But yeah, I would not necessarily spend 4 or 5 seconds, really slowing it down, unless that's something you enjoy. I still do it because it allows me to get a nicer stretch. It feels good. And if I can be anywhere between 2 to 8 seconds, then I'll choose a tempo that suits me. But yeah, it's not a must. Then another variable that we looked at was range of motion, and essentially based on the current literature, which I'm sure you're aware of, I'm sure everybody's aware of by this stage, training at long muscle lengths seems to be very important for hypertrophy, at least based on the current literature. And what we essentially said is that based on the current literature, it appears that utilizing a range of motion that biases longer muscle lengths should be the default approach to exercise technique when trying to maximize hypertrophy. Although traversing the end range of motion at short lengths may not promote an added benefit, and perhaps stopping degrees short could conceivably enhance hypertrophy by different mechanisms like hypoxia. We need more research on different range of motion configurations to draw stronger conclusions on the topic. And the current literature on long muscle length training is limited to a few muscles. That's why we need even more research. But so obviously here we're discussing just training technique overall. So we're not really diving into training methods or strategies. Like we're not like in the paper, we don't go into how you could take that and actually the different sort of shapes that can take into practice, whether you do lengthened partials or you emphasize the stretch using like by pausing at long muscle lengths, which we don't have any research on, or just by using full ROM and just like making sure that you do get to that longer muscle length and you're not spending time squeezing your bicep at the top of the lift, but rather you spend a bit more time focusing on like fully lengthening the bicep, fully lengthening within that range of motion. We've essentially said that make sure you do that. Now, whether you stop short, we need more research. But if I saw somebody performing lengthened partials, me personally, personal opinion, I wouldn't, and they were exclusively doing partials, I would regard that based on the findings of this narrative review, I would regard it as optimal technique for hypertrophy. But that's my personal opinion.
Sorry, did you have anything else to say on the range of motion, or were you going to go to the next one?
I was just going to go to the next one.
Real quick on that. So just to sum that up, it sounds like, again, you're not necessarily saying, hey, you need to do all length and partials, but you just want to make sure that like when you are training, at the very least, you're not skipping out on that lengthened position when you are,
Yes.
if you're doing a full range of motion, just don't skip out on that part there with that essentially.
Exactly. Like not so the way I try to think about it is you're in the gym and you're in a bit of a spicy mood and you're looking at people and you're ready to criticize their form and call them out. And if you look at somebody who's doing, let's say, a lat pull down, as long as they're like, they may not want to necessarily fully touch the bar to their chest, but they may want to bring it like slightly lower than their chin. But as long as they're getting that full stretch and they're not like spending 20 seconds controlling the concentric and eccentric, I would regard that as a good technique, if that makes sense. I wouldn't call somebody out just because it doesn't need to be lengthened partials per se, where you're stopping like at like half of the range of motion and you're staying consistently in that lengthened position. It could be that when you're benching, you're just not fully locking out and holding the bar with your elbows extended and you're just stopping short, just slightly short of that. I would regard that as optimal technique for hypertrophy based
Which
on the current literature.
Which, like, specifically in like a bench press, let's take that one. What you typically see happen, I feel, is you'll see people that kind of skip out on that bottom range of motion there more times than not, because that is challenging down there. And then they do like fully lock out. So it's like in that situation, that's where it's, hey, you're getting it backwards. You probably would be better off dropping weight a little bit, getting a little bit more range of motion, spending a little bit more time in that lengthened position, like in that specific exercise there with that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that you still see that quite a bit. So that's where you could step in and be a C word about it and be like, hey, get that fucking stretch.
Here's this narrative review right here. Look at this. But also too, you also see a lot of people, I feel, really drop the weight pretty quickly on the way down too, potentially if they're maybe trying to get a little bit of bounce
Stretch
on
reflex.
it. Yeah, stretch reflex on it as well too. And that kind of goes against the first part as well, the eccentric. But in saying that, you don't necessarily have to sit there and do a super slow eccentric like you'll sometimes see some people do there with that too, which I was in the same kind of boat as you. I thought that eccentrics you'd want to go a little bit slower, but again, it sounds like, hey, just control it, but you don't necessarily have to go too slow, because I would imagine the opposite of if you're going too slow with the eccentric. And I think you guys hit on this in this paper. It's you end up like volume goes down, and then I guess the intensity probably drops a little bit if you end up going a little bit too slow on the way down there. And I'm assuming same thing if you're super slow with the concentric as well too.
Yeah, would I bet a lot of money that even if you were to go like zero eccentric control and because but you would still go to failure, would I bet a lot of money that you'd see an insane difference in gains? No. In the context of hypertrophy maximization, like absolutely getting the most out of your training as far as muscle growth goes, yeah, I would bet some money that probably like some eccentric control makes sense. But again, take that recommendation with a pinch of salt. It's not like we have direct evidence showing that, oh, yeah, if you were to do this versus that, that would get you, this would get you more hypertrophy. And by this, I mean like some ascension control versus letting the weight free fall and having people go actually to failure, to absolute failure on both in both conditions.
That makes
Nothing
sense.
means anything.
Yep. Awesome. From there, you finished with the first two, range of motion and the centric, the tempo. I know there was a couple other things you guys looked at as well too.
Yeah, we did. And that was the one of the most interesting things for me was the exercise specific kinematics. Ideally, how you set up for and how you perform an exercise. And what was really cool was that, excuse me, we are taught that exercises are performed in this specific manner. This is how you do a squat. This is how you do a bench press. This is how you do a bicep curl. And obviously, it's important to note that those exercises were not necessarily, they were not invented by a bunch of scientists that sat there in a lab and said, okay, we got 20 million in funding, we got 10 years, we got to come up with exercises that are the best for muscle growth for every muscle group. Essentially, exercises were developed by extrapolating from applied anatomy and biomechanical principles, and people back in the day, like back in the day before our parents were born, they were like, okay, I'm going to train my legs now. Let me just bend my knees because that's like the function of the muscle. Okay, I'm going to do this now. And this is called a deep knee bend. And that was like the first sort of iteration of the squat where people were squatting on their toes, not on their heel, not by having the weight evenly distributed and sort of at midfoot. So they were like, yep, knee bend. This is the squat now. And then that evolved into squats as we know them. And then powerlifting and bodybuilding exploded and weightlifting as well. But like back then, there were people saying, "Oh, they're bad for your knees," and there was like a relatively not shady in terms of like malicious practice, but meh study as far as methodology goes that showed that oh, going below parallel is bad for your knees. So then people regarded good technique anything that was parallel and above. And then as powerlifting and bodybuilding became more of a thing, more companies started making equipment. Bodybuilders came up with exercises and people adopted them. And then magazines wrote about them and then, and so on and so forth. So when you look behind the curtain there, that, oh, okay, obviously a squat makes sense biomechanically and from an anatomical perspective as far as targeting your quads and glutes and stuff, but it's not like the way we perform exercises was something that was discovered by scientists, and it shows you the optimal way to perform exercise. Anyways, all that to say that as it stands, we do not have much. We have a couple of studies on kinematic adjustments to exercises and how they affect hypertrophy. So, like in Greece, when I was coming, like I I was born in Greece, left Greece when I was 12, moved to Germany, and for the past 10 years I'm in the United Kingdom, but I go back to Greece often. When I started lifting and I would go to Greece for a holiday, there were specific like kinematic modifications that were proposed in order to optimize hypertrophy. For example, on the lat pull down, have your thumbs over the bar so that the biceps don't get involved, or slightly lean back and touch the bar to your chin. And obviously, like you can make an argument for things and why they may be better because they do X and Y and Z and they affect muscle length differently and so on and so forth. But as it stands, we don't have a whole lot of direct evidence on kinematic changes and how they affect hypertrophy. So whether like we have some exercises on grip, width, and activation, like on the leg press or the pull down, but we know that activation is not necessarily a good indicator of hypertrophy, and that limits the practical implications of those findings. Again, all that to say that as it stands, the evidence, if you're hearing somebody tell you, look, do this exercise like this, and that is going to make a huge difference for hypertrophy, it depends obviously on how they explain it. So, if, but as it stands, we don't have a ton of evidence. And we essentially propose that if you take like general guidelines, vanilla guidelines on how to perform an exercise and adapt to range of motion and tempo, the recommendation that we said, it's likely that you're maximizing hypertrophy. And that essentially fixes the major thing, which is working at long muscle length. So if you're like, okay, how am I supposed to perform a squat? Shoulder width, or my feet width needs to be slightly wider than shoulder width, and I need to squat down while making sure that I don't lose balance. So I have to keep the weight at midfoot. But then because you know that you need, if you want to maximize hypertrophy, you want to be working at longer muscle lengths, that will then require you to modify the exercise so that you can get more depth, so that you can get a bigger stretch on your quads, which may mean that, oh, okay, you will slightly change your width or your stance width. And you may need to potentially use like some external apparatus to, if your ankle mobility is poor, to allow you to do that depth. Or maybe that exercise is not good for you because it doesn't allow you to really utilize that stretch. So then you take another exercise and then you modify it based on these guidelines, and that will essentially more or less allow you to optimize technique versus minute changes that are being proposed, and we see often proposed with very little caution. I'm all for, hey, try doing it this way, slightly bend your elbow and like twist the other way. It might feel much better, and if it feels better, maybe you stick to it longer. But it's important to know that we don't have much direct evidence those exploring those modifications.
So it sounds with that, like, for example, you said there, oh, hey, if you don't wrap your hand around the bar or your thumb around the bar, it's going to take bicep out or something like that. Or I'm trying to think of some other ones that you would commonly hear. But basically, from there, it's, hey, those things might work, but you need to try them out. And you can't really say that for sure and that be the case. Follow kind of the general guidelines for each lift and then adjust it from there based on your body and everything like that. And then, like you said, making sure you hit that tempo that you talked about, making sure you hit the biasing the lengthen position in the lift as well from there.
Yeah, things are pretty simple, man. And as we've seen as well anecdotally, it's not necessarily like a black pill, but like, cool, we are here talking about very like minor details because anecdotally we've seen people achieve insane physiques, both at like a high level of bodybuilding where okay, elite genetics, survivorship bias, and so on and so forth. But like we've seen people get jacked, let me put it this way, by doing a bunch of stuff. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily tell us which approach is best if we were to try and like just figure out for the sake of getting closer to the truth. But from a practical standpoint and from a getting jacked standpoint, I'll say it this way, disclaimer, I am personally confident that since we can get jacked through a plethora of training techniques and quotation marks while still hitting basic boxes like you're lifting weights, you're training with a high intensity of effort, and you're not an absolute, as we say in the UK, joke man about it. Like you're not there doing partials, barely moving the weight, isometrics at short muscle lengths. Like as long as you're lifting weights through a range of motion that, yeah, maybe if you're not getting the full stretch, you're stopping slightly before and you're doing mid. Like we've seen everything get people jacked, and most people listening care about getting jacked. They don't care about absolute, or not most. Like some care about getting jacked, some care about maximizing hypertrophy. But all that to say that I don't think that overall we're talking about like a make or break difference. It's mostly for the sake of getting closer to the truth and geeking out about, hey, what's best, maybe in theory.
To go off your squat or the squat too, it's like maybe one of those things where you could use this in terms of like, all right, hey, you've been doing a bunch of squats, maybe your quads aren't growing as you would like. And then from there, it's like now you can start to make some of those adjustments there potentially to maybe have it hit your quads more, like you said. So just using that, kind of seeing what your results are by the general guidelines, and then from there, altering it if you're not seeing the results that you want to see. But also on that too, as this came up, do see people overthink their technique. It's again, you do want to have it, you don't want to be stupid about it, but at the end of the day, a lot of people will kind of be like, oh, is this tempo perfect? Is this perfect? And then they end up like just overthinking it. And then they're not able to actually like overload and like really push their training as well too. That's just kind of something that I've seen talking to people on social media, clients, stuff like that too. I'm sure that was another part of what you guys were trying to do here with this as well. I guess the last thing on this too that I thought was interesting was the strict versus momentum aspect of it. And yeah, if you don't mind hitting on that real quick. And I thought there were some pretty interesting findings from this side of things.
Yeah, for sure. So that's another thing with that you often hear, that keeping things strict and avoiding the use of external momentum may be maybe something that's taking away from your gains, and stopping, like not using external momentum is often viewed as like a key variable in ensuring that you're maximizing hypertrophy. And but in reality, we only have one paper. Oh, and again, sorry, and allow me to note that absence of evidence ain't evidence of absence. But as it stands, we have one paper, which is a modeling paper that is looking specifically at whether, in theory, in the lateral raise, using external momentum would make the exercise better or worse. But that's not direct evidence and pretty speculative and maybe a tiny bit outdated. But at the same time, yeah, we essentially said we currently don't know if external momentum actually plays a huge difference, because on one hand somebody could say, look, if you're using external momentum to make the lengthened position easier, it may be that you're hindering hypertrophy, at least in theory. And on the other hand, somebody could also say that on exercises like, let's say, a bent over row, a slight involvement of the hips to keep the weight moving at that lengthened position and allow you to do more reps while your back musculature is stretched may actually get you more gains. As it stands, we recommended that you minimize the use of external momentum. And yeah, it's but more research is needed. And there's going to be a study from our lab looking at exactly that. I personally think that, again, if you're going to failure, to like true failure, some like the use of other musculature to complete those last reps, like the slightly bending your back when doing a curl, or I don't know, like using your hips a bit more. I don't think that will make a big, like, it will make a meaningful difference. But at the same time, more data is needed.
Yep. So don't know for sure. We think a little bit's fine. Again, just don't be, just like with all this, just don't be crazy with it. I'm sure there with that. I think it was somewhere where it was like, where was it at in here? So basically, I think the big thing too that you guys were speculating or asking about too was like, if you use that momentum, is that going to help the muscle grow? Or because you're using other muscle groups now, are they going to be under recovered and that's going to impact training later as well too? I thought that was
Oh,
I thought that was an
uh,
interesting kind of way to think about it as well too.
yeah, like with that, I'm like, it sounds like something that makes intuitive sense, because you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna if I involve my hips, but it's pro. Let's say you're involving your hips during a fucking bicep curl. Like, you're working your hips, your hip musculature at what proximity to failure? 50 reps in reserve, and this idea of fatigue, like, you're gonna be fine. Like, it's unless if you're doing heavy barbell rows and you're an absolute dick about it, excuse the cursing, and you're there, and it has turned into like an RDL where you're like actually using your hip musculature and your hamstrings, and it's not even, and like you're barely bending your elbows. Yeah, if you're deadlifting straight after that, maybe not the best idea. But I don't know, man. I don't think the fatigue or the trade-off there is an issue. Plus, you could also argue that if you're actually taking the other musculature that you're not trying to involve to a close proximity to failure, you're probably benefiting from that as well if it's at long muscle length. So, with the example I gave with the row, if your hamstrings are fully stretched and you're there in this partial semi RDLing the weight up and you're like feeling your hamstrings also fail, okay, at least you're getting, it's not what you're intending the exercise to do, but you're not going to miss out on hypertrophy gains from that musculature. Yes.
Yeah, I think too. I think this is something else you guys mentioned in it too. The thought of, yeah, you do generally want to get close to failure, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like staying far away from failure doesn't mean you're not getting any muscle growth either. So you guys took it from both sides of that, where it's, okay, you could be
Exactly.
seeing some muscle growth potentially in some of these other muscle groups by doing it that way.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Exactly like that.
Cool. Awesome. I know that kind of summed up the main things there. So I guess we hit on the practical applications. Is there anything else that like you would say to look out for? Is there anything else that somebody that listens to this can apply to their training and then maybe hit on? You've done it throughout, but future research around it.
Yeah, I would say that if you're looking, and again, this is a paper on optimizing hypertrophy technique to maximize hypertrophy. This is what you need to do in order to make substantial muscle gains. This is just like us trying to see, okay, if your life depended on maximizing muscle growth, what are some things that you could potentially do? Keep in mind that even if you were to deviate from these recommendations by within reason, obviously, but you were still lifting weights at a very high intensity of effort, you are still looking at substantial muscle growth. And as it stands, the combination of variables that has been proposed by us in that paper as an optimal attempt at an optimal approach towards exercise technique that hasn't really been tested to see for us to know that, oh, it actually leads to greater gains than a different combination. You get me?
Yep.
As in, like, this is us saying this is your best educated bet, but it could be in the study that we will run where we're going to essentially test this and see whether this plus other modifications to optimize training technique, whether those actually make a difference in practice. Unless we have that data, this is just an educated guess, an educated bet for those looking to maximize outcomes. These are relatively easy things to implement. So a voice in me says, look, bro, even if you're not looking to absolutely maximizing, unless you have a good reason to not get the stretch and not to be within 2 to 8 seconds of a repetition duration, which is extremely, extremely liberal. I don't know. Like, I don't, why not do it? Might as well get a nice stretch, do your rep, peace. So, yeah, practical takeaways. If you follow the guidelines on this paper, it's likely that you're maximizing that your technique is quote unquote optimal for hypertrophy. PNCs apply, more research is needed, and so on and so forth.
All the good stuff, so on and so forth. There with that. Cool. We're running short on time, so we don't really have time to hit the minimum effective dose. I was just more so curious, is there anything in a couple minutes that you can go over with that? And I'm also wondering, is there a way to look at a hypertrophy aspect of the minimum effective dose? Is that anything you've ever thought of there with that?
Sorry, if what we would combine minimum dose research with technique stuff?
Sorry, so no technique stuff, but I'm just curious, would there be a way to find the minimum effective dose for hypertrophy? Because I know you did it in strength and like 1 rep max and stuff like that. Would there be a way to find general guidelines on that? Is that something you've ever thought about or anything like that?
Yeah, we have that already. It seems to be as low as like a single set per muscle group per week because we have a solid, we have a good amount of data, at least from my perspective, on single sets eliciting significant muscle growth. But then the question is, what's effective? How do we define effective? And does that change as you become more advanced? But it seems like one set equals meaningful gains. Oh, there you go.
That's
And
awesome.
4 to 6 sets per week seem to be like a really nice sweet spot where you're not really doing much volume and you're you're still making near optimal sort of hypertrophy gains. Near optimal, you're not optimal, you're suboptimal, but you're getting the majority of your gains from the one set. But then doing 4 times that, which is just like 4 sets, 4 to 6 sets per week, I think that's a nice minimum effective training, those sweet spot for the majority of people, because you always have time to do 4 sets per week for each muscle group. So I don't know. The way you asked the question, I've been thinking about doing like another narrative review on that, but I don't know if it's required. Because if you look at the volume literature, like that, the answer is essentially there. If you look at meta-analytic data on the dose response with volume and hypertrophy, yeah, that more tends to be better, but that doesn't just because more is better than less. The minimum effective dose is still identified there, and even like in the classic meta-analysis by Schoenfeld et al. That sometimes gets unnecessary hate. It does say that, let's see, anyways, I don't remember the exact word, but it says that the present study shows that marked increases in strength. Anyways, they say something along the lines that even a single set is enough to give you substantial gains. So I don't know if it's necessary to further highlight it, but maybe it's needed. I don't know. We shall
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, just curious on that. I think that's super interesting stuff there to find the minimum effective dose. But we'll have to get you back on to talk about your kind of research around that from strength and powerlifting and stuff, because I think that's a cool thing to dive into and might kind of just see how little you can do if you need to for specific periods of time. Cool, Pac. Well, I guess before I let you go, is there any, I know you've hinted at it a few times here, a couple of research papers coming out soon, any that you're specifically excited about, anything like that?
I'm excited about the technique study that we will run. There's a couple papers in review, but No, I don't want to mention anything specific besides I'm excited to look into technique a bit closer. I'm excited for any potential future research on training at long muscle lengths and specifically like partials at long muscle lengths. But yeah, a lot of cool stuff coming from our lab. I found the part of the paper, the part of the Schoenfeld paper where it says the current body of evidence indicates a graded dose response relationship between resistance training volume and muscle growth. Clearly, substantial hypertrophic gains can be made using low volume protocols, less than 4 weekly sets per muscle group. So it's like we've identified the minimum effective dose there. I'm not sure if it's worth highlighting it and being like, okay, guys, this is it, because people tend to view this paper sometimes or these studies as, oh, what, this was better than this, therefore this is useless. Anyways, I've blabbered on for way too long. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely, Pack. A ton of great information in here. Hopefully, this will help people with their technique for hypertrophy, and we'll have to get you on again in the future. Is there anywhere where you can lead the audience to find you and whatnot?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at dr_pak and on YouTube if you search Dr. Pack, real doctor. Just kidding. Yeah, that's it. All my links are there. And yeah, again, man, I appreciate you for having me on.
Cool. Awesome. Absolutely, Pack. We'll have you on again in the future, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.